Isn't it the case that in your own life, Douglas, that the more deeply that you've peered into the abyss of things, the more likely it is that a light shines through it? And this is sort of the ultimate question of the resurrection, is like, how do you revivify your faith in life? And the answer might be, it might really be, by the radical acceptance of the malevolent tragedy of life, but even more than that, by the radical embracing of even the hellish aspect of life. And that if you did that radically enough, well, who knows what would happen? I mean, we know clinically, if you find what people are avoiding and are afraid of and are disgusted by that's blocking their pathway forward, and you get them to confront that voluntarily, they get courageous and better. It's clearly the case, and it looks to me like the passion representation and its mythological substrate is exposure therapy on a cosmic level. And you know that the more deeply you grapple with the fundamental issues of life, the wiser and broader you get. And then I guess I would ask, if everyone did that to the utmost, what would it be that we might be able to conquer?
Quick update before we get to this video. I've been working on a new series that I think is probably going to be my favorite by far. Before the Nietzsche Master-Slave Morality video, I'll publish a series of probably 3 to 5 videos on shadow work and practical individuation, but from multiple perspectives and using different methods. We'll cover the magnum opus formula of the alchemists, that is, their 4 stages of alchemical transformation. This is what Carl Jung used, at least in part, to create his stages of individuation, and that's the second formula we'll cover. Jung's 4 stages of individuation. Then, we'll cover Christ's teachings that are a practical application goldmine when it comes to shadow integration and individuation. Jung saw Christ as the archetype of the self, a historical figure with an absolute treasure trove of wisdom to glean from, a key archetype in the collective unconscious. As I've said before, Christ's version of individuation is something the Orthodox Church calls theosis, and Christians in general call becoming one with God, or one with the Spirit of God, the ones who talk about it anyway. Jordan Peterson calls it embodying the Logos. Like Paul says, the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. And Christ says, I pray also for those who will believe in me. I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one, as you are in me, Father, and I am in you. So, this idea of becoming one with the highest is what Jung also talks about from a purely psychological standpoint. Individuation is uniting with the archetype of the self and integrating everything that makes up the self. This means embodying the Logos, the Christ, that is, embodying everything that the Christ is. Logos, truth, faith, hope, love, the kingdom of God. The Spirit, aka Pneuma, which is closely associated with the spirit of Sophia in Proverbs, and probably the same thing, which is wisdom. The Christ represents and is all these things. Jung says in Liber Novus, the Red Book, to be Christ oneself is the true following of Christ. In the Collected Works, volume 11, he writes, as the Logos, Son of the Father, Rex Gloriae, Judex Mundi, Redeemer, and Savior, Christ is himself God, an all-embracing totality, which, like the definition of Godhead, is expressed iconographically by the circle or mandala. And in his human manifestation, he is the hero and God-man, born without sin, more complete and more perfect than the natural man, who is to him what a child is to an adult, or an animal, sheep, to a human being. He also says in the Red Book, is there any one among you who believes he could be spared the way? Can he swindle his way past the pain of Christ? I say, such a one deceives himself to his own detriment. He beds down on thorns and fire. No one can be spared the way of Christ, since this way leads to what is to come. You should all become Christs. So, Jung said that the goal of the individuation process is the synthesis of the self, and the Christ is the archetype of the self. But what does the archetype of Christ consist of? What needs to be synthesized? And this is where the two paths, while they're very similar in many ways, they part to a degree. Christ has his methods, which are incredible, but his methods differ a bit from Jung's approach, which is also incredible. Then going deeper still, in yet another philosophy that happens to cross paths with alchemy, Christ and Jung, is the archetypal motif of the tree of life. So lots to cover, lots to organize and write and record, and I'm super stoked about this series. I'm really looking forward to covering everything in detail, but right now I'll leave you with this. Christ said in Luke, and this is paraphrased, "Ask and you'll receive, seek and you'll find, knock and the door will be opened." One of the things we'll discuss in depth in this new series on practical individuation is that verse, what it means beyond the usual interpretations you hear, and how it can be used in the process of individuation. And also the ancient archetypal motif of doors, the Roman god Janus and the mythology surrounding him being one great example of many. The symbolism of which was not lost on Christ, who used it deftly here and in the parable following that verse as well. There's a lot more I want to go into right now, but I'll save it for the series. Here's some related clips from Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau from their most recent conversation with Douglas Murray. And yeah, that's all I've got. Stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.
It definitely appears to me that the story of the Passion is an archetypal and foretold tragic catastrophe. And I'll explain the foretold part later. So it's an archetypal catastrophe because it melds all the worst things that could happen to a person in their life. It is definitely a journey through all the worst things you could confront in your life. But then that's not enough, because there's the mythological cloud, let's say, around the narrative, because dying horribly and unjustly isn't enough. You also have to go to hell and harrow it. And so that would mean that the ultimate extension of the human experience is not only the confrontation with malevolence and unjust death of the innocent, but a genuine journey into hell. Okay, then the question would be, and this is the sticker as far as I'm concerned, isn't it the case that in your own life, Douglas, that the more deeply that you've peered into the abyss of things, the more likely it is that a light shines through it? And this is sort of the ultimate question of the resurrection, is like, how do you revivify your faith in life? And the answer might really be, by the radical acceptance of the malevolent tragedy of life, but even more than that, by the radical embracing of even the hellish aspect of life. And that if you did that radically enough, well, who knows what would happen? I mean, we know clinically, if you find what people are avoiding and are afraid of and are disgusted by that's blocking their pathway forward, and you get them to confront that voluntarily, they get courageous and better. It's clearly the case, and it looks to me like the Passion representation and its mythological substrate is exposure therapy on a cosmic level. And you know that the more deeply you grapple with the fundamental issues of life, the wiser and broader you get. And then I guess I would ask, if everyone did that to the utmost, what would it be that we might be able to conquer? And I don't know the answer to that. Life would radically transform. I mean, I see what happens because people write me all the time. I see what happens when people adopt a certain amount of responsibility for their life. I mean, they write and they say, man, everything's way better. And it's like, okay, how much better could it be? And this is also associated with this idea in the New Testament. There's a section, I believe it's in the Sermon on the Mount, where Christ says, it might not be, but he says that heaven will not emerge and all things will not manifest themselves till everyone brings everything inside them out, right? Their divine possibility, let's say, and that part of the reason that the world is fallen the way it is because we hold back our best, and we don't abide by the law and the prophetic spirit, and we don't bring everything that's within us out into the world, and the world is lesser as a consequence of that. And I do believe that we don't bring our best out because we're afraid and because we're desperate and because we don't have the courage to confront the malevolence and suffering and the hellish aspect of life. And so I do think, so you look at the death and you say, well, is the death more real and the hell more real, or is the resurrection more real? And obviously, in some sense, I'm speaking symbolically. But it seems to me, it's the same idea, you know, that it's an ancient mythological idea that you could go into the belly of the beast and rescue your father. And you know you're trying to do that with your book, The War in the West, right? It's like you see the assault on these values and you're attempting to resurrect those values. I see that as the same pattern. Yeah. Confession is nothing more than a listing of those things about yourself that you know you should shed and get rid of, in the desire to return to something like a more pristine original state. And I think that state is associated with childhood and play, which is, there's an intimation in the New Testament, right, that unless you become as little children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And that is a clearing away of all that traumatic catastrophe that's associated with maturation, and a return to that playful and joyful spirit that so delightfully characterizes children, unconscious though they may be. You have to be aiming at something transcendent and eternal and that contains the infinite in the finite. And why wouldn't that be incomprehensibly weird? And isn't it possible that the emphasis on phenomena like the virgin birth and the death and the resurrection and the word at the beginning of time and the sacrifice of the lamb aren't all part of that language that nails down the finite to the infinite in a way that isn't amenable to the mere disruption of reason? Like music isn't amenable to the mere disruption of reason. It's got to be something like that, because look what we do in the cathedrals. They're stunningly beautiful. They take hundreds of years to build. They're full of music. They're full of strange practices and Gothic symbolism and death. And it's very uncanny and strange, but it's not trivial. It's gazing into the abyss that makes you better. The thing is, and this is maybe where Nietzsche's idea is not as differentiated as it became. Sometimes your gaze can be forcefully directed towards the abyss, and then you're traumatized. If it's involuntary and accidental, it can kill you. The more it's voluntary, the more transformative it is. And that's part of that idea about facing death and hell. It's like, can you tolerate death and hell? And the answer is, this terrible answer is, yes, to the degree that you're willing to do it voluntarily. And then you might ask, well, why should I have to subject myself to death and hell? I'm innocent. And then the answer to that is, even the innocent must be voluntarily sacrificed to the highest good.